Thank you, Grant. Appreciate that. Before I get started, there's some important things to say, and one of them is on behalf of Alex Miller and myself to thank so much Christy Grally for organizing a great conference, inviting us, granting us such great hospitality and warmth, and it's been a privilege to be here, and thank you. So both Alex and I want to say that. Second thing I want to say is I'm not a preacher. I'm here in chapel, so this will be a little bit more like an academic talk than a sermon. However, I do want to spring off of Reverend Hendrick's talk in chapel on Monday. And he was using the verse from Psalms, "Teach us to number our days that we may gain wisdom." And I want to talk about ways to make our days count for the purposes of wisdom or for wise purposes, and talk in that case about disability and dependence. Even though I'm not a preacher, I'm going to take a text. So I've got a text here that we're going to work on. It's from John 9, and as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth, somebody with a disability. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." So we have a person with a disability, a person blind from birth. Think about what it would be like to have been blind from birth. Bad thought. And that the disciples ask all the wrong questions. They want to know who's to blame, how do we understand this in terms of the life or blame on this particular person who was born blind. And then Jesus says, this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And that verse always to me was what? God caused this particular man to be born blind, that Jesus might reveal God's work? And so that question kind of is going to hang there for this talk, and then we'll come back to it at the end. What I want to do is talk about disability and dependence, and disability is a major part of the work I do. I've been spending the last 30 years studying a disability called agenesis of the corpus callosum. So to illustrate that, on the left there, you see a person with a normal brain. That's normal in quotes because that's my brain. And the first thing you have to know is I have a brain. And the second thing is that I have what's called a corpus callosum. So you can see in the red circle a white structure that looks like the head of a hammer. And that's 200 million neurons crossing from my right cerebral hemisphere to my left, and from my left to a right, back and forth between the two. 200 million nerve fibers or axons that carrying information back and forth between the two sides. On the right, you'll see a person with agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum. So you can see there that there is an absence of the corpus callosum. That big white structure in my brain is just not there. These are people who are born without it. It's a congenital disorder. They actually, if that's all that's wrong with their brain, they function fairly normally, but they definitely have a disability. They function a little bit like high-functioning autism, that they have some significant, particularly social deficits, but they can be cognitively kind of in the normal range. So I've spent 30 years with my grad students at Fuller studying this disorder, and so we do a lot of experimental neuropsychological research on these persons, but we're also very much involved with the families. So we help start the National Organization of Disorders of the Corpus Callosum, which is now a fairly large organization, have meetings every other year of about 500 people, families that come. Down in the middle on the bottom there, those are all individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum that are at the meeting. My students do a lot of work doing social skills training and other kind of actually entertainment stuff for this group while their moms and dads go off and listen to people like me talk about agenesis of the corpus callosum. So that's one kind of disability I am paying attention to in my professional life. The other is a disorder called hemispherectomy. So this is removal of one entire cerebral hemisphere during childhood for the treatment of epilepsy. So young children that have intractable epilepsy that are getting 50 to 100 seizures a day, you just have to stop this. So a heroic last-ditch effort will be to remove the hemisphere where the seizure is beginning. And interestingly enough, these people actually function pretty well also. So you can see the person on the bottom there playing a little basketball has a paralysis of one side on the opposite side from the hemisphere that was taken out. They'll have a paralysis. Other than that paralysis, the brain reorganizes well enough to function fairly normally. And our current question is, to what degree is that normal, and to what degree is that, particularly in the long-term consequences of adults who had a childhood hemispherectomy. Now you'll look, so again, we're involved with the families. We go to the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance conferences, so those pictures from the conference, and so we're involved in these families as well. These families and parents could never have imagined that they would have a child with these kind of issues. And so their need to figure out what's going on, what can we do for my child, and so these conferences are basically trying to help the families understand how to cope with this disorder and to know about the disorder and know what it's like. Hemispherectomy has been topic for this fella. So Rod did his dissertation on hemispherectomy. If you didn't know that, there he is. There he is in the 2012 International Neuropsychological Society bias poster, and you'll see that little picture up there. It's the MRI scan that I just showed you. So there you go, Rod. But those are kind of my professional engagement with disability. But in 1995, my wife and I were driving through Colorado. We had an automobile accident, and she had a spinal cord injury, a C6-7 spinal cord injury that left her partially quadriplegic. So for 17 years, Janet and I lived a life of trying to figure out disability and life in a wheelchair and how to get around. And the first thing we had to learn was how to fly, because she was president of the National Organization of Healthcare Quality. Their meetings were in Chicago, and so we had to figure out how to fly to Chicago regularly. So that was very personal engagement with disability. So being that much engaged in disability, I was always interested in finding people that could talk well about the nature of disability. And I ran across Alistair McIntyre, and Alistair McIntyre's book, Dependent Rational Animals. And the general theme of this book is that we can only become smart, wise, and mature, that is rational. So McIntyre uses the term rational for smart, wise, mature. We can only be smart, wise, and mature persons by first and always acknowledging our dependence on others. We only become smart, wise, mature by first and always recognizing our dependence on others. But he goes on more specifically about disability, and this is the part that meant the most to me. So he talks about the scale of disability. McIntyre says there's a scale of disability on which we all find ourselves. Disability is a matter of more or less, both in respect to degree of disability and in respect to the time periods in which we are disabled. So I drew a little scale of disability there. Less disabled, more disabled. At any particular time, you might be more disabled and you might be less disabled and I am more disabled. And for some period of time that may be true, but some later time you may be more disabled than I am. And so we live, all of us, always, according to McIntyre, on the scale of disability. So it's not there are disabled and there are non-disabled. We all live on a scale of disability on which we are variously placed at different times, and that is a dynamic scale. It moves around. So Janet and I, in a New York minute, entered into the world of disability in an automobile accident where she broke her neck and severed her spine. So that's one concept that's helpful, I think, is to have us focus on the fact that disability is not something over there. Disability is something we live with and live in all the time. And some things are disabling that we might not call disabling. Like if I get severely depressed, that's a disabling situation for me at the time. And so there's all kinds of things we can talk about that would exist on that scale of disability. McIntyre goes on to say, for it is, and perhaps always been, a common assumption that blindness, deafness, deformed or injured limbs, and the like, agenesis of the corpus callosum, hemispherectomy, quadriplegia, etc., 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 exclude the sufferer from more than a very, very limited set of possibilities. And this has often been treated as if it were a fact of nature, that the possibilities for that person with a disability is limited by the nature of that disability and what they can accomplish on their own. And we've acted as if that was just sort of the story. So my wife in a wheelchair, well, that's the story, and that's all that can be accomplished in that situation. So he goes on to say, what is thereby obscured by this attitude about disability is the extent to which the obstacles presented by these afflictions can be overcome or circumvented depends not only on the resources of the disabled, but also on what others contribute. Others whose failures may be failures of imagination with respect to future possibilities. That our failure in response to disability is a failure of imagination about what might be the possibilities and how we might, in fact, intervene and help to expand the possibilities. So McIntyre concludes what disability amounts to depends not just on the disabled individual, but on the groups of which that individual is a member. On the groups of which that individual is a member, and the degree to which we exercise our imagination. So that's one thing, Alistair McIntyre. I'd like to kind of move to some things I wrote, actually. So sometimes back in the 1990s, we did a book, me and a number of other scholars did an edited book called Whatever Happened to the Soul. And the basic premise of this book was that being human is to be a body. Being human is being a body. Not a body and a soul, but a soulish body. And so we decided we would write this book and write through the sciences and into philosophy and theology from the point of view of an embodied understanding of persons. To be a human is to be a body. So we started with evolutionary biology, genetics, neuropsychology and neuroscience, cognitive psychology, which is the chapter I wrote, and then on to philosophy, biblical studies, theology, and kind of wrote through a whole consistent book out of the sciences and theology and philosophy with this consistent point of view. Again, my chapter was Cognitive Contributions to Soul. And in this, I was making this argument that we have cognitive capacities. Those capacities we use in our relatedness, relatedness to ourselves and others, even relatedness to God. And that constitutes soulishness, that we don't have a soul, we are soulish people. And we are soulish people to the degree that we are relational. And I wrote this whole chapter, and I got to the end, and I thought, oh my gosh, I just wrote out all the disabled people that I study and work with, and thought, oh my God, I can't go there. So I sat down and thought about this a while. I basically painted myself in a corner in my chapter, and so I was sitting there trying to think, how am I going to get out of this? And I actually thought about something that I think is important for us in this discussion, and that is the idea of asymmetric relatedness. You know, asymmetric is two things are not totally equal. So asymmetric relatedness suggests that, let's get this. Relationality is reciprocal, but not necessarily symmetric. So a relationship with another person will always be a reciprocal kind of thing, but it doesn't have to be symmetric. Symmetry in relatedness is the exception. Asymmetry in relatedness is the rule. And that means that one person, for the moment, is carrying more of the burden of maintaining and sustaining the relatedness than the other person can reciprocate at the moment. So your roommate may be depressed, and you've got a long-standing relatedness with your roommate, one of your best friends, but at the moment, your friend cannot sustain the reciprocal relatedness, and you, not being depressed, at least today, have to carry a greater amount of the relatedness. So deep relatedness does not require both persons to be equally able. All right? That's how I got myself out of my corner. The more I thought about it, the more I thought this is actually an important theological point, at least I thought so, and that is that God's call on the life of all persons and groups, i.e. the church, think the church, is to sustain the personhood of others through extending relatedness that may not be reciprocated in the degree due to their disability, all sorts of disabilities. So we are called, I think, to sustain the personhood and the relatedness of other people at times when they are not able to reciprocate that. Think, for example, of newborn children. They are in some way less abled, and therefore mom and dad sustain a relationship with this child until the child can grow enough to be a lot more reciprocal. Think of dementia and old age. I think about dementia and old age, or at least old age. This is creeping up on me. So I think that is an important call for us with respect to making our days count, and count in the ways that result in wisdom about life, is to understand and respond to our response to maintain the personhood of other people, even when they can't reciprocate that relatedness. So back to our scripture. Jesus said, "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." And I asked the question, what? God caused this particular person to be born blind, that Jesus might reveal his works? And no. I think what this means is we all exist on the scale of disability like the blind man. We're all the blind man. We are all disabled in different times and in different ways, that God's blessings might be revealed in the midst of our vulnerability through the relatedness manifest in our communities. So God's blessings are revealed in our interdependence. So just to kind of summarize, being human is to exist on the scale of disability, but what disability amounts to depends not just on the disabled individual, but on the groups or communities of which that individual is a member. Oh, I've hit the time right on here. So let's close in a prayer that I will read here for us. Lord, teach us to number our days in light of our human vulnerability, and help us to develop wisdom as we come to recognize our dependence on one another, and to develop a rich imagination for ways to support each other. Amen.